Hey there, this is Natalie, and in this video I want to talk about Ruijerd, in particular what happens after he separates from Rudeus, as we saw him do at the end of the first season of the anime. It goes without saying then that this will contain spoilers about all of the plotlines involving Ruijerd from later in the series, and I will be going right up to some of the stuff from after the climax of the main Mushoku Tensei story, from the side story series called Redundancy. Now, Ruijerd was a character who underwent a lot of change while he was travelling with Rudeus and Eris, and additionally, after the devastating fight with Orsted, he learned that the Supard race had had a curse passed on to them by the demon god Laplace. The curse is focused on their green hair, which Laplace also had, and causes people to hate and fear them, much like the curse that Orsted has. This means it's not just the actions of the Supard warriors centuries ago, which were also caused by Laplace, that caused the strong reaction to the Supard we see from characters such as Roxy. Rudeus learned from Hitogami though that the effects of this curse could and would weaken with time, and that their efforts so far to improve the reputation of the Supard hadn't been in vain. Rudeus will continue to try to spread the word about the true history of the Supard and improve their name for the rest of the story. It's actually something he never stops caring about, no matter what else is going on. He even ends up starting a business that publishes books of Ruijerd's story, written by Norn, and they come with copies of Rudeus's original Ruijerd figurine. You can check out my video about Zenoba Chiron, who is heavily involved in this particular one of Rudeus's ventures, if you want to know more about that. These books sell pretty well, because they also include a table of characters that help people learn to read. Plus, Rudeus tends to give them out to random people he meets throughout all of his adventures. It isn't enough to reverse all of the fantasy racism against the Supard, but it does make some impact. And it also serves as a way for Rudeus's endless gratitude and affection towards Ruijerd to show through his actions, even when Ruijerd is absent from his life. Which Ruijerd is, for actually most of the story. We do see him again briefly, which I'll get into in a minute, but it's not until the build-up to the final climactic battle of the series that he is properly reunited with Rudeus and rejoins the main plot. At the point where he leaves Rudeus and Eris, Ruijerd wants to find and connect with other surviving members of his tribe. And now that he's spent the last 3 years travelling around cities and interacting with people a lot more than he had in the centuries since the Demon-Human War, he feels ready to go off in search of information. He has completed the journey he committed to and brought Rudeus and Eris back to where they came from, and as we saw when he parted from them, he now recognises them as adults. Ruijerd showing that recognition to Eris actually coincided with her 15th birthday, which is when people are considered of age in this setting, so this was another marker of the coming of age part of the story for Rudy and Eris coming to a close. Of course, it was with sadness on the parts of all three of them that their times as the party Dead End came to an end, but it was the right time for it. The next time we as an audience see Ruijerd, he's travelled all the way back to Milishon, and he ends up connecting with Paul's group. Roxy has by then made it back to them with the information about where Zenith is, which she got from Kashirika at the end of the anime season. Ruijerd rescues Norn, who's threatened by some men in the city, and she instantly begins to see him as a hero. Roxy, on the other hand, is absolutely terrified of him, Roxy having grown up with all of the stories about how the Supard are pure evil and will eat people. Still, with Paul, Lilia, Roxy and the other trusted members of Paul's team in Milishon preparing to head out and rescue Zenith, Paul decides to send Norn and Aisha to stay with Rudeus, who's now settled at the Ranoa Magic University. Ruijerd is to be the one who will escort them there safely. While Rudeus does receive a letter from Paul telling him that Norn and Aisha will be coming to stay with him and that they'll be escorted by someone he knows, Rudeus doesn't know when they're going to arrive or who will be coming with his sisters. Letters take a really long time to cover those sorts of distances, as do travelling parties. Still, he's now living in a mansion he bought for cheap with his new wife Sylphy, and so he has plenty of room for them to stay. Unfortunately, when they do arrive, they don't get the best impression, as Rudeus and Sylphy had just been out drinking with their friends from the university. Norn, who still hates Rudeus after the incident with Paul, really doesn't want to live with him, and really clings on to Ruijerd. Ruijerd too is a little less warm than Rudy was expecting. It seems that Ruijerd was strongly shipping Rudeus with Eris, and he can't really get used to the fact he's married to Sylphy. It's Ruijerd, in fact, who first suggests to Rudeus that maybe Eris didn't mean what he thought she did when she left. Given Rudeus is in a much better mental state now than when Eris first left, he is somewhat open to entertaining this idea, but it will be a long time before he finds out the truth for sure and is reunited with her. By the time Ruijerd and Rudeus meet again, Rudy will have taken Eris as his third wife, so Ruijerd's ship will eventually become canon and he'll get to be reunited with Eris too. For now though, he's a bit disappointed. Now, during this period, the Demon King Badigadi has also been hanging around the university. He originally showed up to challenge Rudeus, a duel which Rudeus actually won, but Badigadi did give himself some handicaps in the fight. After that, Badigadi then joined the special student class and just sort of stuck around for a while, mostly drinking beer in the cafeteria with Zenoba's dwarf child slave Juliet. You know, normal college stuff. He's the fiancé of Kashirika and factors into a lot of the stuff in the final battle. But here, what's important is that he speaks to Ruijerd after he leaves Rudeus's house. And after that, we don't really see either of them again until the final parts of the series. Rudeus doesn't know what's discussed, but Badigadi tipped Ruijerd off about where the other Supard may be located. It should also be noted that Badigadi has a bit of a grudge against Ruijerd due to the events of the Human-Demon War. Now, after this, Ruijerd and Rudeus end up being separated for many years, and both Rudeus and the audience are left not really knowing what Ruijerd is up to or whether he's achieving his goals. This may sound disappointing, given what an important character he is in terms of Rudeus's life and how popular he is with fans. But actually, that just makes Rudeus's eventual reunion with him all the more interesting. This will be an event both Rudeus and the audience have built up in their minds, and when it happens, it almost goes quite tragically. But we have to back up for a second and talk about what's going on in the world in general, and with Rudeus at the point where he next meets Ruijerd, for their eventful reunion to make any sense. I'm going to be brief with the details because this is a video about Ruijerd and not the overall plot of the entire last part of the series. But Rudeus is now working with Orsted, and their enemies are the people who are being manipulated by Hitogami, just as Rudeus was early on in the story. Orsted's main goal is to eventually kill Hitogami, though he won't be able to do this in Rudeus's lifetime, due to needing something from Laplace in order to reach where Hitogami is, in the Void World. Laplace won't reincarnate until decades later, so what Orsted and Rudeus are doing is trying to move the world in the most favourable directions for Orsted to get useful people on his side who will help in the future. Hitogami is moving against them, but he can't interact with the world itself, and can only affect things by influencing people, who are known as his apostles. He was trying to win Rudeus over to becoming one of his pawns early on in the story, but people in general tend to be easier to win over than Rudeus. This is because Hitogami has an effect that's kind of the opposite of Orsted and the Supard, where people automatically like and trust him. This doesn't work on Rudeus because he's from another world, so Hitogami had to try a lot harder to gain his trust, which is a lot of what we see with him giving Rudeus useful advice and information. Hitogami's goal in influencing people is simply to prevent his own death. He can see the future and see it changing as different things happen. And so he uses people to try to prevent things Orsted is doing from working, to kill people who have the potential to kill him, or even to stop certain people ever being born. It was his attempt to kill Roxy when she was pregnant with Rudeus's child, Lara, that eventually led to Rudeus switching sides. And if you want to know all about what happened there, check out my video about Turning Point 4. So, after a lot of stuff happens, it's revealed that Gisu, the former member of Paul's adventuring party, who Rudeus first met when he was imprisoned in the Beastman village in Season 1, has been one of Hitogami's apostles for a long time. Gisu is not a strong fighter on his own, but like Rudeus, he's been gathering together powerful allies and gearing up for an ultimate battle between his own side and that of Rudeus and Orsted. Now, Orsted may well be the strongest, but he has very slow mana regeneration and was forced to use a lot of his mana in a fight with Rudeus right before Rudeus joined his side. So the intention is to keep him out of the battle as much as possible and try to bring other useful people and factions either onto their side or at least to prevent them from joining Hitogami's side led by Gisu. I'm very much oversimplifying this as it's a large portion of the later plot of the series, and I just want to cover what's necessary to put the stuff with Ruijerd in context. Now, while he's gathering allies, Rudeus ends up hearing about a village that's being troubled by monsters from a forest. He also has some information about sightings of Ruijerd and where he may be, and suspects it's the same place, the Forest of No Return, as it's charmingly known. Again, I am really oversimplifying this just to get to the Ruijerd stuff. When Rudeus investigates, he finds that this forest hides a large village where the surviving members of the Supard race are living, and Ruijerd is there too. After a reunion, he asks Ruijerd to lend him his strength in the coming battle, assuming that with Ruijerd's hatred for Laplace, who Orsted needs to defeat as well, Ruijerd's help is pretty much a given. But all is not well, because the Supard are all suffering from a mystery sickness. And it transpires, Ruijerd has been tricked by Gisu into letting a mysterious slime named, quite ominously, Dark King Vita inhabit his third eye, having been told this will allow him to suppress the advancement of the illness and keep the tribe alive. In return, he promised to aid Gisu in a battle he was preparing for, though he had no idea the enemy would be Rudeus. Ruijerd has conflicting loyalties, wanting to help Rudeus because of their friendship, but also believing that Gisu is the only reason he and his tribe aren't all going to die. He's lied to the chieftain and said that there is a cure for the plague affecting the Supard, but there isn't. And for as long as Dark King Vita has been possessing him, he hasn't tried to do anything untoward. If Ruijerd has to weigh the lives of all of his tribe against his fondness for Rudeus, then the only conclusion he can reach is that he'll have to fight for Gisu and become Rudeus's enemy. Rudeus struggles to think of another way. He thinks that since Ruijerd actually told him all of this rather than just killing him, he must really want there to be another option. But the only way he can think of to make it possible for Ruijerd to betray Gisu is if he can find a way to cure the Supard. He asks Ruijerd if he would ally with him if the disease can be cured. Ruijerd remains silent, and so Rudeus explains that Gisu is operating under the direction of Hitogami, and Hitogami has betrayed many other people before, himself and even Gisu included. He tells him that there's a good chance that once Ruijerd is no longer of use to Hitogami, Dark King Vita may leave, and the tribe will all be doomed anyway. Ruijerd says that if such a cure exists, then he would be willing to fight alongside Rudeus, but he's not sure if it does. Rudeus says he plans to ask Orsted, who knows many things, but to Rudeus's surprise, Ruijerd says that Orsted had already visited them 2 years ago when the first patient became sick. Rudeus doesn't know why Orsted never told him he knew the location of Ruijerd, This was something that had already been bothering him for other reasons, but at this point, Rudeus has worked so closely with Orsted for long enough that he trusts that there would have been a good reason. Still, as they're discussing this, suddenly Ruijerd's eyes, including the whites of his eyes, turn a deep blue, and he begins acting strangely. Rudeus sees that the gem on Ruijerd's forehead is glowing and understands straight away that he's being possessed. But before he can do anything, Ruijerd grabs him and kisses him. Rudeus feels something slimy going down his throat, and that's the last thing he remembers before waking up. And I think we've all had nights like that. What follows is probably the trippiest sequence in all of Mushoku Tensei, as Rudeus is subjected to repeated hallucinations in which he wakes up in different what-if type versions of his life, including one where he's married to Aisha and one where he's married to Princess Ariel. Each time, Paul appears and reminds him he's dead, which breaks the illusion, but then Rudeus just faces a different dream. This is basically him battling Dark God Vita's powers. He eventually defeats Dark God Vita using a magic ring that he got during a previous arc, and is able to wake up, and he vomits up a blue slime that can only be the Dark God's corpse. But with his own death, Dark God Vita has effectively caused the power suppressing the plague on the Supard to disappear, and as Rudeus comes round, he sees Ruijerd has become extremely ill. Now, Ruijerd's decision about who to ally with has become irrelevant, because all of the Supard will die if a cure can't be found. Rudeus uses teleportation to return and talk to Orsted, and returns with him to the Supard village. Doctors are also sent from Azura, but they don't know how to cure the plague either. But then, Norn, Elena Lise, and Cliff arrive, and Norn helps to nurse the Supard, while Cliff, who is not only a genius, but also the grandson of the Millis Pope, Millis having the best healing magic in the world, tries to work on a cure. Again, I'm oversimplifying a lot, but Cliff realises the condition the Supard have is similar to something they've encountered before, a condition called Drain Syndrome that Nanahoshi suffers from, where the body can't handle the magic in its surroundings. In Nanahoshi's case, it's because she's from another world and can't process mana at all, but in the case of the Supard, it's because of the environment they're living in. There is a tea that can make the body expel the excess mana, which they've been growing for Nanahoshi, as she'll always need to regularly drink it, and this ends up saving the Supard too. Ruijerd is not back to full strength when the battle against Gisu's side begins, but he and the other Supard are on the mend, and he is, once again, on the right team. Now, that climactic battle between Rudeus's forces and Gisu's is really the end of the main part of Mushoku Tensei, but the author did write a series of stories called Redundancy that talks about what various characters did in the time between then and Rudeus's eventual death of old age. He uses these chapters to give closure to a lot of characters' stories and answer some of the questions that were left hanging. And the very first Redundancy story serves as an explanation for Orsted having mentioned a daughter of Ruijerd's who was born in every other loop he'd seen. In every loop except this one, the Supard living in the forest had been completely wiped out by the plague, leaving Ruijerd, who didn't seek them out, as the last remaining Supard, and his daughter with a human who became a Supard warrior too, the last of her kind. The Supard's magic eyes allow them to see the weakness on the demon god Laplace, which was how Ruijerd had been able to be involved in the fight against him in the past, and so Orsted had originally sought out this girl, Luicilia, to do the same, but he learned that Laplace, when he's reincarnated, is mortal, and so her skill isn't necessary. But she'd been a close friend to Orsted, and he really wanted to meet her again in this loop. Ruijerd, when Rudeus saw him in the forest village, did mention he was single, and so where this daughter would come from was a question still left open at the end of Mushoku Tensei, but it didn't really take the greatest theorizing skills to figure out that Norn was in love with him. And in Redundancy, Orsted reveals to Rudeus that in every other loop, Norn had indeed been the one Ruijerd married. It seemed they usually met because in these loops, Norn became an adventurer, and Ruijerd saved her at some point doing some Ruijerd stuff. In the loop where Rudeus is present, Norn instead becomes a writer, but of course she has known Ruijerd since she was a child in this loop anyway. With Orsted strongly shipping them so that they can conceive his bestie, Rudeus makes moves to suggest their marriage, and finds out that they're actually both in love with each other anyway, so all is good. Their wedding is held at the Supard village, but they also incorporate elements of the traditional Millis wedding, which we see earlier in the story when Elena Lys and Cliff get married. Because, in case you didn't know, Elena Lys marries the Pope's grandson. Norn then stays there living with the Supard, and as in all of the other loops, they have a daughter who goes on to become a Supard warrior, though this time she's not the only one left in the world. So that's what happens next for Ruijerd, right up to him being happily married to Norn and them raising Louiselia, who we will hopefully see more of in the sequel series. Let me know in the comments what you think about how his story ends up, and if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing because it really helps me out if you do. Before I go, I just want to give a quick plug for a series I'm doing on my channel at the moment, reading out the Mushoku Tensei prequel web novel, Old Dragon's Tale, which has a lot of important lore about the setting of Mushoku Tensei and the history of Orsted and Hitogami's conflict, as well as being a really interesting story with Laplace as the protagonist. Check out the link on the end card if you want to listen to it. I've tried to make it a relaxing audiobook type thing you can chill out to. Parts 1 and 2, which cover the first 4 chapters, are out now, and I'll be keeping on with the whole of the story, which is about 1 light novel volume in length, so look out for new parts in the coming days, or, of course, ring the bell to be notified as soon as I upload them. As always, thank you to my supporters on Patreon who are on screen right now, and to everyone who helps me out by subscribing and watching my videos. Thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.